Hi everyone and welcome to World War I TV with me, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson. For this show, Woody is around, he's lurking in the background, he's going to be taking your questions and popping up when you guys have got something to ask our guest tonight. And our guest tonight, no better person, it's the 1st of July, it's the anniversary of the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, and we're very, very pleased to welcome Professor Gary Sheffield, best-selling author of books like Forgotten Victory, which was one of the first books I really kind of picked up and really got into the First World War and sort of myth-busting with, and the Somme, and his biography, of course, of Douglas Haig. He's president of the Western Front Association and professor of military history at the University of Buckingham, where he runs a military history MA based in central London. Gary, hello, welcome.
Hi, Lucy. Hi, and hi, Paul.
It's really good to have you here today. Now, we're going to really, I guess, just dive straight in, because bearing in mind a lot of our audience might not be super familiar with the Battle of Somme, I guess the first thing, if you don't mind, is just starting with just a tiny bit of context on just how the Battle of Somme, why was this offensive launched, what's the background to it, and then we can just get into what we think we know about it and maybe what we don't know about it.
Right, well, to go all the way back, the war of movement in the West, in France and Belgium, begins in August 1914. By the end of the year, in fact, by about late October, beginning of November, the fighting had become stalemated and you had trench warfare. So basically, trenches, very crude at this stage, not much more than sort of, connected holes in the ground with a bit of barbed wire out in front, stretching from the North Sea down to the Swiss frontier. And at this stage, the French army was by far and away the largest army on the Allied side, up, of course, against the Germans. British armies, much smaller, plays a significant but actually relatively small role in the fighting in 1914. 1915, the British army gets progressively bigger. The French and the British launch a series of offensives, none of which make any real progress. And so by the beginning of 1916, actually the British army is becoming really quite big. So Haig, the British commander-in-chief, has 60 divisions in hand at the time of the Somme, so the middle of the year. And the planning is that the British and the French will launch a major offensive at some time around the halfway through the year. June is the original time that they come up with. And the original plan to fight on the Somme, why do they choose there? Because basically that's the area in Picardy where the British and the French armies join. The French, with good reason, are a bit suspicious of how good their British allies are going to be, because the British army is very inexperienced. It's it is yet really to take on board the amount of experience of very tough fighting, or rather to say fighting on a very large scale, that the French have had for many months by this stage. And so the original idea is that the French will take the lead, and if you like, they will mentor the British through their first big battle. Problem is, of course, it's all blown off course by the Germans attacking further to the south around Verdun in February. Long story short, an enormously grueling attritional battle sort of begins at Verdun, sucking more and more French troops into the battle. And so by default, the British, who are going to be the junior partners in the Battle of the Somme, actually lead off with a much reduced French contingent. And so on the 1st of July 1916, the British army begin their first major, in terms of scale, offensive of the entire war, much bigger than anything they fought before, but it's all new to them. And so it's a step into the unknown.
And I think the key thing here to think about is really the British they're still pretty much the junior partners in all this, aren't they? This is not, I think, the Somme, particularly in Britain, and we'll come on to maybe a bit of a discussion about how, certain battles are remembered in different countries for different reasons. The Somme is huge, in Britain. You ask people on the street about the First World War, Battle of the Somme, that's the thing they'll come up with 9 times out of 10. But it's interesting that actually at the time, this was really the French were the major players sort of in the planning role, weren't they? And there's a question that's come up here, Gary, that sort of links into one of the things, maybe the first kind of point to discuss was, it's about when did British start mass conscription? And there's this idea, isn't there, that pretty much all of the troops that fight in the Somme are sort of Kitchener's army, are the new guys, and they're all sent in with no training, and that's why there were such high losses.
Well,
that one.
To answer the question of the viewer directly, conscription is introduced in stages, but the first bit is in January 1916. Now that means that I think it's unlikely you're going to have any conscripts in the battle line on the 1st of July 1916. Certainly you get them towards the end of the battle, but the armies, the British army that fights at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, starting on the 1st of July, is primarily volunteers drawn from Kitchener's army, so the 1914-15 volunteers, also the Territorial Army, Territorial Forces it was called at the time. There are still a number of pre-war territorial volunteers with them, but otherwise other people have joined territorial units since 1914. And there's still some regular soldiers there. I mean, there are regular battalions certainly fighting. The 29th Division is a regular division, for example. How many of those soldiers in July 1916 are actually pre-war regulars is an interesting point. But certainly you have three broad categories of soldier fighting on the 1st of July. So that's Kitchener's army, territorials and regulars. Actually, there's a fourth, because you've got Dominion troops. Now, on the 1st of July, there's only one small contingent of Dominion troops involved. That's the Newfoundland Regiment, who fights with the 29th Division. Later on in the battle, of course, you get the Australians fighting at Pozières. You get the Canadians coming in at Courcelette, the Kiwis, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, and we shouldn't forget the Indians. Most of the Indian Corps has left France at the end of 1915, but there's some Indian cavalry units which play a fairly significant fighting in later in July, particularly on the 14th of July. But basically, this is a mass volunteer army, most of whom have been civilians just a few months, I should say, before. The question about how well trained they are, it depends on which unit you're looking at. I don't think it's fair to say they're all sort of lambs led to the slaughter, as people used to say a few years ago. There's a bit more experience than that. But generally speaking, the British Army is not terribly experienced. And that, of course, includes the commanders, who mostly are commanding at a level way above their previous experience. So Haig, of course, begins the First World War as probably the second most senior British commander. And his experience is commanding two divisions of First Corps. And just 2 years later, he's commanding 60 divisions. Wow. That's a huge step up.
That's a huge step up. And we'll come on to Haig in a little bit, because, you know, that there's a lot of very divisive character still, you know, yeah. But just to kind of, maybe just for our viewers who are kind of, right, they hear the Somme, and the first things that come to mind, you know, when I speak to people who don't know anything about the First World War, a few things, you know, mud, blood and futility. Those are the things, you know, the incredibly high casualty rate, and that it was all for nothing. All these men died, and that it was all for nothing. But there's a different view on that, isn't there, Gary? There's this idea that actually the Somme is a victory.
Well, okay, there's two parts to that. First of all, is the Somme, by extension, is the First World War futile? Now, I've actually made an entire career arguing no. The whole futility bit goes back to the idea that the First World War was a war fought over trivial issues. In effect, it's a war fought about nothing. The overwhelming amount of scholarship over the last half century suggests that's not the case. That actually, in 1914, Germany made a bid for world power, the phrase used by a prominent German historian in the 1960s, which was not dissimilar, actually, to what happened in the Second World War. Now, the big difference, of course, is that Kaiser's Germany was not racist and genocidal in the same way as Hitler's Germany was, but it was bad enough. You know, the way the Germans behaved in the occupied territories, in France and Belgium, in what's now Poland, and in Ukraine and indeed Russia, was pretty bad. I mean, it was a bid for empire in a way that Napoleon would have recognized. So the fact that the Germans in the Second World War were even worse is no reason to look back somehow as Kaiser's Germany has been somehow benign and beneficent. It wasn't. And so in that sense, the war, I think, was fought as a war to defend the existing status quo. That included democracy. Britain was not a full democracy in 1914. It had become so by the end of the war, shortly afterwards. But nonetheless, it's defending, a liberal, broadly democratic state against a pretty unpleasant enemy. Also factoring the empire. Now, today, we don't consider the empire to be important. In 1914, 1918, people did. Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, for the most part, regard themselves as being in some way British, as well as in their own nationality. And the empire was important. We've got different views on empire today, but we shouldn't, in my view, superimpose today's thinking on what people thought 100 years ago. It was a different thought. And fighting to defend the empire was seen as being a really big deal. On top of that, looking specifically at the Somme, was it futile? Well, if you mean did it make no difference at the end of the war? No, clearly it wasn't, because it did not result in a sort of classic victory like Waterloo or Alamein or something like that. And I actually shy away from using the phrase victory, although some historians do. But I regard it as being a strategic success for the Allies. The reason I don't like the word victory is it sort of conjures up the wrong impression.
It sounds very decisive, doesn't it? Victory sounds like,
It does, and it is not decisive in that things there and then don't change overnight. I mean, do you want me to talk about at the stage about the outcome of the Somme? Because I think that's the easiest way of saying why.
Well, let's just, before we do that, perhaps let's just, I mean, and kind of maybe if we can lead on to it from this, is obviously today is the 1st of July, and so much of our focus when we talk about the Somme is on the first day. But
sure.
as I'm sure you're going to go on to say, of course, this wasn't a one-day battle. This wasn't a one-day affair, and everything that goes on in the months that follow, this culminates in all of these things, these lessons being learned, and the British really a baptism of fire in some ways. And so, I guess it's interesting that we kind of always focus on the first step, but what happened in those interim months, and if you can then sort of discuss about the end and the outcomes,
sure.
Just to lead us through it briefly, that would be really great.
Okay, well. The battle begins, well, actually, say the 1st of July. Actually, for the Germans, it began 7 days before that, because there's a 7-day preliminary bombardment, which we tend to forget, but that's significant. And it actually goes on technically to the 18th of November. In fact, there's sporadic fighting even after that, but let's just stick to 1st of July to 18th of November. So 4.5 months worth of fighting. Now, that is far more than a day's worth. And one of the reasons why I think people got so fixated on the 1st of July is partly because of the huge casualties. We'll come back to that in a minute. But also, I think, because of the historiography. I mean, two of the key books which deal with the Battle of the Somme is Martin Middlebrook's book, which is called The First Day on the Somme. Marvellous book. Pretty well the first book, not quite the first book I read on the First World War, but I read it when I was about 13. It made a huge impact on me. Still regarded as being one of the best books of the First World War.
Brilliant. Recommend it to everybody watching.
Absolutely. What wonderful book. But the problem is, by zooming in on one day, which is a perfectly valid thing to do, it distracts attention from everything else which followed thereafter.
I feel the need to jump in now and make that D-Day reference, because I am banging on all the time that the Battle of Normandy is a very different thing to study than D-Day. The difference between D-Day and the first day of the Somme, in my limited understanding, is that D-Day pretty much is a roaring success, whereas the first day of the Somme isn't. But as the campaign evolves, things then become much more interesting and nuanced, and things go are clearer to understand. And I'm always banging on about the fact that you can't look at Goodwood without looking at Epsom. You can't look at Epsom without Goodwood and Boot and Cobra. As I'm learning my First World War stuff with Lucy, I'm realizing that the Somme, the first day of the Somme, is part of a series of events that have to be studied together, and the context is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of what's happening in Normandy on the 1st of July, is that the day with the the major German counterattack is broken up, breaking the panzers and all that. I mean, which, most people who know anything about Normandy will know about D-Day, won't know anything at all about that.
True.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, both D-Day and the 1st of July 1916 are the beginning of a campaign, not the end of it.
Mm.
I suppose in both cases, I think you can say D-Day and the 1st of July, at the end of those days, it marks the beginning of a phase in the battle, but only a phase, not the battle itself.
And I might throw in the question from Lord Lloyd here, and perhaps you can expand this, Gary, is let's compare the results to the pre-battle expectations, because that's another thing as well, is what was the plan supposed to achieve, and did it achieve what it was supposed to? And I'll hand it back to you and Lucy.
Yes and no, because Haig's preliminary planning, it's very clear. He had a plan A and a plan B. Plan A is everything goes swimmingly. The artillery bombardment does its stuff. The infantry breaks into the German positions. You then release the mobile reserves, cavalry and infantry, and they're fed through the lines. And you push through, probably not in a day, but in a matter of days, perhaps a week, you end up with some sort of culminating battle, well to the rear of the start line. Now, clearly that doesn't happen. Although, as I'll say in a minute, it came actually closer to happening than some people would have you believe. Plan B, and Haig is always very pragmatic. He recognizes that if the maneuver battle, which is what he really wants to achieve, doesn't work, well, attrition, grinding down the enemy, actually is a good second result, not least because that will lead to a breakthrough at some point in the future. In fact, it's much more remotely in the future than he realizes, but he's not entirely wrong about that. So at the end of the 1st of July, actually, can you go back to the map of the 1st of July, Lucy? You've got a slide on that. That's it.
One. Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Right. That line through the middle of the map, going left to right, is the Alberta Bapaume Road. And broadly speaking, north of that line, on the 1st of July, there's pretty well complete failure. There's some limited local successes. The Ulster Division, for example, do very well at Thiepval, but they're driven back because they can't be supported. But north of the line, at the end of the 1st of July, effectively the Brits are back in their trenches. South of that of the road, however, actually things are very different. The further south you get, the more success there is. Ending up in the French sector, French 6th, I think it is, army on the British right. They basically take all of their objectives, very light losses, and are looking over their shoulders, wondering where the Brits are.
And that's another thing, Gary. Sorry to just interrupt, but that's another thing, right? Because this is not just a British battle, and so often the French are forgotten here, right?
The French are forgotten, but actually the French play a much reduced role compared to the original planning, but actually they play a significant role, and they're much more successful on the 1st of July than are the British. People want to know about the French army on the Somme. My friend, colleague, Professor William Philpott, William Philpott, his book Bloody Victory came out in 2009, is an excellent overview of the Somme, particularly strong on the French because he's a historian of the French military. Anyway, but the two corps, the 13 Corps, which is next to the French, and I think 15 Corps next to that, the two British corps, they do very well as well. They succeed in taking, 13 Corps succeeds in taking all of its objectives. The two divisions there are 30th Div, which is a division of northern POWs battalions from Liverpool and Manchester largely. And the other division is the 18th Eastern Division. My friend and mentor and lecturer on Lucy's First World War course, Professor Peter Simpkins, his favourite division, in fact, among military historians, the 18th Division is known not as the Eastern Division, but Simo's own division. And 18th Division do fantastically well as well, and all sorts of reasons for this. They've got a very switched-on gunner, Alan Brooke, who in a later war, of course, becomes Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The commander of 18th Division, Major General Sir Ivor Maxey, is probably the best trainer in the British Army. everything comes right. But the other important thing to note here is on this front, the German defences are actually very weak, certainly compared to those north of the road. You only have to go to the Somme and walk around. See, north of the road, the Germans hold on the whole high ground. It's obviously very, very tough. South of the road, it's much more open, and the Germans don't have anything like the same degree of dominating positions.
And Gary, you mentioned the landscape there. So the Somme is to have the high ground on the Somme just gives such a dramatic advantage. I mean, it does anywhere, but on the Somme in particular, these areas of high ground, they make all the difference, don't they? In many instances on the first day.
Well, they absolutely do. And a question just asked: is the Somme Valley flat? Yes, it is, but it's steep on either side. But on the and indeed the Valley of the Ancre, the river to the north of the smaller river to the north of the Bapaume Road is also, in fact, even higher ground than in fact around the Somme Valley. Okay, so I mean, here I think it's worth introducing one of the major controversies and problems about the Somme is that Haig, it's always seen as Haig's battle, which is true up to a point. I mean, he's head of Shed. He takes responsibility for what happens. I suppose also, I guess, takes blame or credit for failure or success. But his operational commander is General Sir Henry Wilson. Wrong guy, sorry. General Sir Henry Rawlinson, commander of 4th Army, and it's Rawlinson who is if you like, the man on the spot, the operational commander. Now, there's this big myth that Haig basically won't stand for any argument from his commanders, that he basically tells them what to do. They have to get their heels together and get on with it. Absolutely not true. Haig's way of planning is actually to come up with a plan or look at the plan drawn up by his subordinates, and then they discuss it. They bash it backwards and forwards between them, between commanders, between their staffs, until they come up with a plan that they are happy with. Now, this actually has many strengths, but also has some weaknesses, particularly allied to the fact that the British command culture of the time is a rather strange one, in that the commander-in-chief can suggest to his subordinates what happens, but actually, if the subordinates want to ignore it, well, actually, you defer to the man on the spot. And again, pretty quickly, what actually happens in the planning for the Somme is that Haig believes firmly that you should plan for operational success. So therefore, he sets up reserve army under one of his proteges, Lieutenant General Sir Hubert Gough, which consists of cavalry divisions with attached infantry. The idea being that once you smash a hole through the enemy positions, you then start feeding through reserve army. Gough's mobile army is its nicknamed. Rawlinson is never happy with this concept. He sees the way forward as being bite and hold. So you actually mass your artillery, you take a bite out of the enemy trenches using infantry, fairly narrow advance, you stop, you consolidate, you bring up the artillery, you smash up enemy counterattacks, you then do the same thing over again. You see Monty doing much the same thing in Normandy, of course. One of the many connections between Normandy and the Somme, battles I think have got an awful lot in common. And the problem is that Rawlinson basically gives lip service to Haig's plan, doesn't believe in it, and in reality subverts it. So at midday, on the 1st of July 1916, complete disaster north of the road, considerable success south of the road. And what does Rawlinson do? He actually orders Gough's army to stand down. He doesn't even have his operational reserve, which is 9th Scottish Division, ready to come forward. So even though the German front line is collapsing, there's nothing available to take advantage. Patrols push forward and they find places like High Wood and Delville Wood, woods which are rapidly occupied by the Germans and take weeks and months and thousands of casualties to take, and there for the taking on the 1st of July 1916. So in my view, is Haig culpable for the failures of the Somme? clearly, up to a point, he is. He, for example, insists on spreading his artillery quite thinly so you don't concentrate firepower against key objectives. But actually, I think equally culpable, maybe even more so, is Rawlinson, who throws away a chance for genuine success by refusing to accept that actually there's something other than bite and hold. Now, I should say that even if Rawlinson had actually done everything that he was expected to do, you're not going to get Haig's major breakthrough. All sorts of reasons why not least that the BEF, British Expeditionary Force, the British Army in France, is not capable of sustaining logistically an advance on that scale. But what you might have got is an advance of 1, 2, 3 miles, which actually would take you right across the historic 1916 Somme battlefield. It would have been a major political victory. It would have enhanced Britain's standing within the alliance. It might even have rattled the Germans sufficiently to come to a compromise peace. That's a long shot, but it's not impossible. Even if you get a more and even longer advance than that, that's not this major breakthrough, advance 10, 15, 20 miles, politically, that would be dynamite. It would be a really significant victory. And that is theoretically possible if Rawlinson makes the right moves on the 1st of July. I think actually, even if he had done the bare minimum, which he should have done, you've got an advance of 1.5 miles, 2 miles. In 1916 terms, that's really significant.
I think the key thing I'm taking away from this discussion is, really, I mean, there's so much to say about commanders in the First World War, so many truths and untruths, and a lot of it at the time, there's this group learning that goes on, but also an individual journey that all of these guys go through. When you look at Rawlinson and Goss and Haig, and it's all very well and good to now sit back and look at these chaps and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, and to make judgments, particularly of Haig, as he has, his reputation has kind of been here, there, everywhere sort of over the years. But the key thing really is that this was the British Army and High Command trying to find the best route possible. And yes, mistakes were made, but it wasn't through a lack of care. This whole lines led by donkeys thing, of course, this myth that started, in the 1960s with that book, that's so unfair, isn't it, Gary? Because really, even though through all the discussions that these guys had, and just from what you've said there, okay, some decisions were right, some were wrong, but it wasn't through lack of thought.
Absolutely. I mean, the so-called learning curve debate has been a major thing over the last 25, 30 years. Sometimes I'm blamed for it. Honestly, it wasn't me. I was very junior when the whole thing kicked off. But there was a whole series of historians like Peter Simpkins, I've already mentioned, Brian Bond, and much more junior people like me in the late 80s, early 90s, who started thinking a lot along these lines. And the phrase learning curve, I actually think was born in an informal seminar in a pub around the corner from the Imperial War Museum at some point in the early 90s. But these, someone once put it slightly facetiously, but there's some truth in it. These generals did not wake up in the morning, write note to self, going to try and kill as many of my own soldiers as I can today. They are trying to grapple with a form of warfare which is unlike anything that they've faced in their career. The tactical conundrum of the Western Front is really simply this, that there's a temporary dominance of defensive fire over the offensive, meaning that when you're attacking, you're facing unprecedented amounts of firepower in the form of quick-firing artillery and machine guns. And if you dig trenches, if you put soldiers in trenches and put a bit of barbed wire out in front of them, they're very difficult to kill. You actually have to be extremely accurate with your artillery. And at the beginning of the war, artillery simply isn't capable of hitting trenches accurately with the right degree of accuracy routinely. Later in the war, they are, and that's one of the reasons why things change. But in 1916, you still got this great dominance of the defensive. So you've got these guys in trenches firing machine guns. You've got massive artillery support, and then you have got soldiers advancing towards these entrenched soldiers. It's not surprising that there's enormous casualties. And really, the story of the fighting on the Western Front, tactically anyway, is the attempt of all the armies, the British, the French, and the Germans, to grapple with these problems. And by 1918, certainly, they haven't come up with a complete solution. They have come up with a solution that is good enough in order to reopen mobile warfare. So projecting forward, of course, 2 years and a month from the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, you've got the Battle of Amiens, 8th of August 1918, fought about 20 miles to the south of the Somme battlefield, in which the British and French armies, including powerful Canadian and Australian contingents, advanced 8 miles in a day. So more than across the entire Somme battlefield in 1916. And that's what can be done 2 years later. But they only get there through learning the hard way.
I'm just going to have a pause there, Gary, because I want to just ask Woody, as somebody who's kind of new to the First World War to some degree, and obviously from our viewers as well, is there any questions? Because we spoke a lot about the commanders, and I know that's a really sort of key point. Is there anything that you want to kind of throw in at this point?
Well, I'm just hearing the same kind of things that come up on World War II TV. That leadership is nuanced, and we tend to want to put leaders into a category of either being brilliant all the time or awful all the time, and it's never that simple. And there's always this learning. There's always this progression and development of ideas and doctrine, and it takes time. New ideas take time to implement, especially as I'm listening to what you're saying about the First War. In the static environment of the First World War, new ideas take a lot of time to bring in. But I want to bring in a couple of the questions about artillery, because we've got the history explorer who's serving in the RHA, who wants to bring some stuff. I'm interested in what Gary thinks about this comment here from Lord Lloyd. French artillery doctrine is much more advanced in July 1916. What do we think about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. The French have had longer to learn. The French artillery arm, of course, is bigger. The British actually catch up fairly quickly. And the Battle of the Somme, I would say, is a pivotal moment in their learning. But the French artillery is better than British in 1916. I mean, a really simple point to make, well, two points, is first of all, to take a sort of competent infantryman in 1916 doesn't take very long. You only have to master a few basic skills. To make a competent gunner, now that's much more complicated because it's a much more technical arm and all the rest of it. The second thing, of course, is that even if your gunnery is very good, if you're firing dud shells, it's not going to do you a lot of good. And the British, and that for the matter, North American munition workers are undergoing a learning curve of their own. And actually shell production, there's still a lot of dud shells appearing in 1916. Just to give an example of the success of the importance of French gunnery to the British, one of the reasons why 13 Corps does so well on the 1st of July, I think, is undoubtedly because the Germans are being hammered by the French artillery on their flank. And actually one of the reasons why the 36th Ulster Division up at Thiepval do very well, at least initially, is they happen to have a French artillery battery attached to them, which is simply better than the British equivalent. By the beginning of the Battle of Arras in April 1917, which is the next major British battle, the Royal Artillery is as good as the French, in my view. They've become more sophisticated. They've learnt stuff, and by 1918, the Royal Artillery is absolutely a battle-winning weapon.
And I think
it was in 44-45.
And I think the key thing again to think about here is sometimes when people say, the Battle of the Somme, we just think it's one continuous, and actually it's made up of these different, these smaller little offensives really, which gives the British and indeed the French as well chances to make those changes. And there's a question here that's coming from Joe. Can you, Gary, comment on the changes in assault tactics from the beginning of the battle through to its conclusion? So can you add a bit more detail and put into real terms that learning that went on?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first thing to say is a big myth that on the 1st of July 1916, all the British troops attacked in a uniform fashion. In other words, they advanced, in a loose wave, 3 paces apart, walking very slowly towards machine gun fire. Actually, that's a bit of a sort of stereotype, but in any case, it's not true because not every unit advanced in that fashion. So if you look at different units, there's a great deal of devolved command, which is a bad thing in some ways, but actually it does allow local commanders to take advantage of local terrain. So, for example, the Tyneside, Scottish and Tyneside Irish brigades attacking toward La Boisselle on 34th, part of 34th Division on the 1st of July. They had rather different ways of advancing. Not they did very good because the gunners didn't get it right, not least because this attempted to hit too many targets, which must be traced back to Haig. But there are all sorts of ways of doing it. An example I came up with many years ago when I first started looking at the Battle of the Somme is 19th Division puts in attack at La Boisselle on the 3rd, I think it is, of July, but several days after the beginning. And whereas on the 1st of July, the 34th Division advance and get cut down, the 19th Division actually, of course, they start from closer in because they start from what's known as a Loch Nagar crater. A huge mine was blown to the south of La Boisselle, which didn't actually achieve its objective on the 1st of July, but it means that for the 3rd of July, they could actually attack from the crater, which gives a certain amount of cover. And the British carry out what's known as a Chinese bombardment. In other words, they further up the line towards Villiers to the north, they open up a bombardment as though they're about to attack there, but then they launch an attack to the south. They rapidly get into La Boisselle itself. And so they've taken the Germans by surprise. Once they're in there, there's a pretty stiff fight to hold on to it, but they do. Now, either they had thought up their tactics from scratch in those 2 or 3 days since the 1st of July, or, which I think is more likely, they'd actually talked to the divisions already gone into attack. 19th Division is in reserve on the 1st of July, and they have worked out what happened, what didn't happen. And you find that happening time and time again. 23rd of July, 1916, 1st Australian Division attack and capture Pozières. So basically on the German second position, slap bang on the Bapaume Albert Road. They do that by using their artillery pretty effectively, but also by using some innovative tactics. And again, they've spoken some British divisions have fought in the area, works out what works, what doesn't. Then, of course, you have tanks being introduced to fast forward. 15th of September, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, which is actually like a subset of the Battle of the Somme. And so you find new tactics being used yet again as the tanks advance alongside the infantry. And. In fact, there's almost as many examples of infantry tactics as there are divisions. At the end of the battle, in the winter and early spring of 1917, the British basically pull together the lessons of the Somme in new doctrine, encapsulated in the vital doctrinal pamphlets SS 135 and SS 143. And this is a mixture of learning lessons from individual units, speaking to the French. The British and the French are attempting to learn to each other. And these units are now, for the Battle of Arras, are being trained on the lessons they learned from the Somme. So if you look at Arras, the first day of Arras, the 9th of April 1917, is dramatically more successful than the 1st of July 1916. The Canadians, Canadians and British actually, capture Vimy Ridge, but there's advance of 3.5 miles by 12th Division further south. It's a really spectacular success. And that, I think, is very largely thanks to the fact they've learned the hard way infantry and artillery lessons on the Somme. They've codified them, they've trained on them, and then they put them into action. Now, Arras, there's all sorts of problems, not least because they're not yet at the stage of being able to carry out mobile warfare, but in terms of positional warfare in set-piece battles, they've learnt the lessons from the Somme extremely well.
Yeah, it's a very real, example, and a very clear example of this learning that you've discussed, Gary. Just to have a little pause and again here, just to take some viewer questions. Woody, what have we got coming in?
So Ian Carr is asking, Rawlinson was not dismissed. Is this because of a lack of alternatives?
Partly, yes. Rawlinson is actually sidelined in 1917. He basically doesn't do anything, doesn't have an operational command in 1917, comes back in 1918. The Rawlinson-Haig relationship is a fascinating one. They are not best buddies by any means. And Rawlinson is a very devious character. Haig got him banged to rights early in 1915, trying to blame a subordinate for mistakes which actually were Rawlinson's, and he hung in the balance of being sacked. This is when Haig is an army commander and Rawlinson's a corps commander. Rawlinson is kept on because Haig is very open about this in writing in his diary. He says that, okay, he's not entirely trustworthy, but actually he is a decent commander, and I haven't got that many decent commanders to use. And Rawlinson actually in 1918, I mean, he's been described as man of the match by another historian. In 1916, his progress is patchy, but yes, Haig keeps faith with him because he thinks he can still do a job, and frankly, there's not that many other people to replace him. Just briefly to go on from that, I should actually say that there's a fairly sizable turnover of commanders after 1916. So, for example, in 1918, if you look at the army commanders, First Army, General Horn, he's a corps commander on the Somme. Second Army, Plumer, well, he's still the commander, but he doesn't fight on the Somme. Third Army, Byng, he's a corps commander. Fourth Army, Rawlinson, he comes back. Fifth Army, after Gough gets the push, it's Birdwood who'd been a corps commander, and a lot more. There's not a lot of other examples of commanders stepping up, from brigade to division to corps to army. So actually, there is a reasonable turnover of commanders at the top after the Somme.
Okay, we've got a few more questions, and this I think ties in the fact that Lucy and I we want to go well beyond the Western Front on World War I TV. So Joe Rooney is asking, wasn't the Allied offensive in 1916 also meant to be coordinated with the Russian offensive in the East?
Yes, it was. In fact, 1916 is really the only time in the First World War when the Entente powers, so Britain, France, Russia, Italy at that stage, of course, America doesn't come in until spring 17. That's the only time they really get their act together. And so there's a major conference at Chantilly, I think it is, at the end of 1915. The Allies come up with a plan. There's a sequential series of offensives. So basically, they don't all happen at once. The idea is that they kick off one after the other, forcing the Germans, in fact, the Central Powers, including the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottoman Turks, they'll be forced to sort of stretch themselves very thinly. So the Russian offensive, the Brusilov offensive, kicks off on the 4th of June, I think it is. Somme, 1st of July. There's an offensive in Italy. And yes, and actually, there's some debate about how close the Central Powers actually come to breaking in the summer of 1916. There's evidence, there's a loss of confidence on the German home front. The take up for a German war loan is lower than it would expect. And there's even some speculation that when the Romanians enter the war in August 1916, that might just have been, the straw that breaks the camel's back. As it is, the Germans react really rapidly and destroy Romania, knock it out the war, all but knock it out the war very, very, very quickly. And the Germans get over their wobble in the middle. But there's this tantalizing August 1918, the Allied strategy almost puts unbearable stress on the Germans. But it's as I say, it's the only time in the war this really happens across the Allies.
Brilliant stuff. Well, tying in with that and connecting again with some other themes you want to bring up on this channel is History Explorers saying, we've spoken a lot about British artillery and their preparatory fires, but the enemy gets a vote too. How did the German artillery perform in disrupting British movements? And I think this pre-HR, this ties in with this idea of when we're talking about Normandy leadership or Italian leadership, whatever it is the enemy always has a say as well. So just because the leaders we're talking about from the Allied point of view may or may not be performing to their best, the enemy are involved in this as well. So German artillery disrupting British movements, Gary.
Okay, well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, the Somme isn't just, or at least the 1st of July, isn't just an Allied failure, or at least part failure. It's also a German success or part success. Battles are two-way things. German artillery isn't massively effective in disrupting preparations, partly because actually the Germans are pretty heavily outgunned, because don't forget Verdun is their major effort on the Western Front at this stage. And of course, the Russian Brusilov offensive is launched primarily against the Austrians, but the Germans have to send considerable numbers of troops to shore up their Austrian ally. And there's plenty of evidence from German soldiers that they find the Allied, by which I mean largely British, shelling to be absolutely horrendous. You know, we think about the terrible losses, the terrible suffering of the British soldiers on the Somme. The Germans are suffering just as badly. But ultimately, the German army is highly skillful. It's forced to change its defensive methods because the initial German response, and this will no doubt resonate with Woody from Normandy, is that the Germans counterattack any enemy lodgement and try to retake it. Now, the problem with that is that they so routinely carry out counterattacks, often it's counterproductive, that actually they're retaking territory which they can't really hold, and it'd be better off for them to simply let the Allies have it. Great historian John Terrain, writing about the Somme, back in the 70s, said that what he describes as the true texture of the Somme wasn't simply the British and French attacking, but also the German counterattacking, and that racked up German casualties. When Ludendorff and Hindenburg replaced Falkenhayn as the effective supreme command of the German army, nominally the Kaiser's still in charge, but he gets pushed to one side. One of the things they do is actually change that policy, and so there's far less an emphasis on counterattack. Still happens, and they move away from holding distinct trenches rather to holding thin lines of shell holes and going for defence in depth. So I mean, you mentioned Goodwood earlier. The German sense of having a sort of checkerboard defensive position, bringing fire on attackers who are canalised by advancing forward. That really is born on the Western Front. And you see some good examples of that in the second half of the Somme offensive in 1916. So the Germans fight very hard. They're always, I think, outnumbered and outgunned by the Allies. Allied air power actually is pretty decisive at the beginning of the Somme offensive, but from September onwards, the Germans start to deploy more air assets to the Somme, and so they find it much harder, which of course has a knock-on effect, because the key role of air power in the First World War is spotting for artillery. And if you can no longer get your reconnaissance planes over the enemy trenches, you can't spot as accurately, so you can't relay information back, and the artillery can't fire as accurately. So in the end, the British Germans, French, basically fight each other to a standstill on the Somme. But the end result, I think, is the Germans take an attritional pounding, which they really can't replace that manpower. The Allies suffer grievously as well, but they still can. And so in sort of operational tactical terms, it's a stalemate. The Germans actually abandoned most of the old Somme battlefield in the spring of 1917, pulling back to the Hindenburg line, a newly prepared position, which actually allows the Allies to present the Somme as a victory. After all, the Germans were there, now they've gone away. In strategic terms, I think the Somme is absolutely critical, because Germany recognises for the first time that they're up against not two major land powers, France and Russia, they're up against three, France, Russia and Britain. Before that, they had largely discounted the British army as being ineffective. Britain was seen largely as a naval power, but now they know they've got a third major land enemy up against them. And the Germans try to find another way to defeat the British, which is to reopen unrestricted submarine warfare. They send their U-boats out into the Atlantic. They can sink anything which floats. And that inevitably means sinking neutral ships as well as British ships. That and they recognise that means almost certainly the Americans are going to come into the war, which of course they do. The gamble is that the Germans can defeat the British before the Americans can deploy forces in sufficient numbers to make a difference. That's a gamble which fails. In my view, the Somme, all that it's ghastly and apparently ends in stalemate in 1916, is, as I said earlier, it's an Allied strategic success. It's a crucial stepping stone on the way to victory in 1918. Put it this way, if the Somme doesn't happen in 1916, I think you need to have something very, very like it in order to produce victory in 1918.
Wow.
And I think that's the key thing to take. Well, I mean, in my view, I don't know about you, Gary. For me, that's the key thing for people to take away from this is nobody is saying that the terrible losses are something to be belittled or aren't a tragedy or aren't an awful thing. Nobody is suggesting that, but it's almost a case of it's without going through a process, how would we have got to where, how the British, how the Allies would have got to where they needed to be in 1918.
Yeah.
There's no real, counterfactual. It's very difficult to put that in any other any other sort of way, really. I mean, and it's almost like that process had to happen at some point. So it happened on the Somme.
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortcut to victory. I mean, if you're talking about total wars between roughly evenly matched adversaries, as you get in the First War, as you get in the Second World War, it's all about attrition. It's about wearing down the enemy's resources, which includes people, soldiers. It's about breaking their morale. It's about wearing them down. The only question is, how do you do it? In the First World War, it's very largely done on the battlefield. It's also done at sea, not least by the Allied blockade, which has an enormous impact on the German civilian population, starving them, in effect. In the Second World War, it's more of the same. It's attrition, whether it's on the battlefield in Normandy or at Stalingrad. It's also strategic bombing. It's attrition, however way you slice it, it's attrition. It's just a different way of doing it.
I mean, we've got a few minutes left, but the one thing I just want to mention there's a couple more questions coming, but before I put those to you, Gary, before Woody does, the one thing I want to mention is we've spoken a lot about artillery, we've spoken a lot about offensive tactics and kind of the teeth of the army, but this is the tail as well. So the logistics, communications, which I bang on about logistics a lot, and I did a thread on Twitter about it this morning because it's something that often gets forgotten. But the British logistics, the BF logistics in the Battle of the Somme nearly collapsed. It was like a slither away from totally collapsing. The lessons that were learned in that and bringing in the civilian expertise of Eric Geddes and all of that again was another just transformatory kind of event that occurred largely as a result of what occurred on the Somme.
Absolutely right. I mean, Allied. Talk about British logistics. That's what I know about. British logistics in 1916 were pretty good, but they were put under enormous strain as a result of the Somme. If you just think about the sheer effort involved in getting hundreds of thousands, millions of shells to the batteries, getting however many rounds of ammunition up to the front and all the rest of it. I mean, and British logistics really did come under strain. As you mentioned, Sir Eric Geddes, who's in peacetime, he's a railway executive. He's brought in, and over the winter of 1916-17, he and others reorganised the BEF's logistics on a much more sound footing. And all of this is part of this learning process. So again, fast forward to 1918. What are they able to do? Not merely do they advance 8 miles at Amiens, they're then able to do something they couldn't even do a year earlier. And that's one of the reasons why, following the Battle of Messines in June 1917, they don't go straight away and attack at Ypres, as many historians have argued they should have. They couldn't, logistically, they just couldn't do it. By 1918, they can. So what do they do after Amiens? They then shut down the offensive on Fourth Army's front. They switch the point of attack 10 miles to the north on Third Army's front, which actually includes the Somme 16 battlefield. They then launch another attack. Now that sounds easy, but actually it's it's a tribute to the impressive advances in logistics. They actually have light railways. They have sufficient motor lorries. They have all sorts of means of actually moving stuff very easily from one point to another. They also have such a vast superfluous is the wrong word. They have such a huge amount of stuff, to use a technical term, whether it be food,
forage,
animals, what have you, forage, all the rest of it. They can actually launch attacks at different points up and down the front. They don't need to shift vast numbers of stuff from one place to another. Now that can't happen overnight. It happens as a result of this huge investment in logistics, particularly from 1916 onwards, but also in the hard-won logistic lessons of the Somme. Now, I think it's fair to say the details of logistics don't set the pulses racing.
They do for me, Gary.
They do with me. Oh, yes.
They do for me too, but with three sad people together. But actually, if you don't get the logistics right, nothing else works. And until comparatively recently, last 20, 30 years, historians tended to look at armies and just sort of not really wonder about how they got from A to B and how they sort of fed themselves when they got there. Now, logistics is such an incredibly important branch of the military art. It's become an incredibly important part of military history, thankfully so.
Well, I'm just going to jump in with some questions now. And also, everything you've been saying, Gary, is this reminding me, and I'm sure Lucy, how many subjects we can discuss, because it's like a buffet of different choices being thrown at me now. Oh yeah, air power. Oh yeah,
logistic shows.
We'll do all of this at some point. But I want to do some questions. First thing is actually some compliments. I think analysis of the Somme really has to start with Gary Sheffield. History Explorer is saying Gary is smashing this out of the park. Vlogging through history, Chris is in Gettysburg right now for the 160th anniversary. Great point about the larger strategic consequences of the Somme. But I've got some particular questions here. So Dan Hill, who's just come off his own live event on YouTube. Dan Hill from the Battle Guide is saying, really interesting. He's going back to the advances on the first day. Gary, do you think the relative southern success to French artillery, better terrain or lighter defences, or a combination of all? That's from Dan Hill there.
Yeah, well Dan, we did talk about this earlier, I suspect, when you were doing your own broadcast. I saw you were doing that. It's all of the above. It's all of those things. Increasingly over the last few years, I've come to, as I've actually done more reading about it, frankly, realised how good the French army was in July 1916 compared to the British, which in many ways is not entirely surprising. But it just strikes me again how impressive the British successes were over the next few months, because certainly I would argue by the end of 1917 the British and French really were on a par. But yeah, the French do incredibly well on the Somme, and you can understand why they were frustrated that the British were lagging behind. I mean, literally lagging behind them as they push their way forward on the southern part of the battlefield.
So I'm going to be the annoying co-host and bring something up that I was reading about on Twitter today, and there's been several comments in the sidebar, but I'm going to use Jay's as an example. Troops ordered to walk, not to run. Such a tragedy. And I saw on Twitter today, and Peter Caddick Adams got involved. Yes, they were ordered to walk. No, they weren't ordered to walk. They didn't walk. They did walk. Clear it up for us, Gary. The walking is it just such a big rabbit hole? We're going to be here all night.
Yeah. Sure, it's some were and some weren't.
Right.
That, as I said earlier, there's a much greater level of tactical devolution than many people have taken on board. So yes, some troops clearly did advance slowly, and the reason for that is basically so they don't lose their cohesion. Other troops went forward in sort of almost like sort of light battalion columns. Others got out of their trenches before no man's land and sort of got as far forward as they could. Some did walk, some didn't. But it's wrong to say everybody did it, and it's certainly wrong to say somehow high command dictated what should happen. If anything, the criticism should be the other way: is that Allied high command should have been more prescriptive than they actually were, because there was some bad practice going on as well as good. It was down to local examples. Sorry, local tactical decisions by the commanders.
And Chris, vlogging through history, is saying, so the Powells at Sayre walked. Is that correct?
I think some did. Chris, I don't know enough to say hand on heart that all of them did. Conceivably, yes, but that was the decision of the local commander. It certainly wasn't the case of Rawlinson or Haig saying, you do it like that.
Okay, well, I think we'll do that with enough questions from the viewers now. I mean, we're going to obviously revisit this subject again and again on this channel, but I'm going to let Lucy sort of take us home with her last final comments and questions to you. But so I'm done with my questions from the viewers. But yeah, Lucy, let's begin to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Gary. I think that the problem is there is so much to talk about with the Somme. I'm sure we'd love to have you back, at some point in the future, because,
I'll be delighted.
As Woody said, there are just, this is not just one day, and there is so much. I think for me, the takeaway here is that this is not a black and white thing. I mean, so often we spoke about this in previous shows for World War I TV about how oftentimes you're asked questions and actually the answer is usually yes, but also no. It's about discussing the different views. It's about bringing in different areas of historiography over the different periods. And the Somme is a great example of how views on the battle, whether it was good, whether it was bad, what it achieved, what it didn't, on the personalities of the commanders, their decisions and the details, that's changed. And our understanding is still shifting, still developing. And so I think the key thing really, and that your talk from me has brought home again tonight, is just this idea that taking these one sentence views of any kind of battle or action is a silly thing to do. That's basically it for me, because no matter what, there are so many factors that taking the time to kind of look into things and dig deep into the details, that's really, and that's never ending. That is the rabbit hole of military history, right?
Lucy, can I just ask a question? One of the viewers flashed up, because only 6, max 10 battalions went over the top. I didn't know that. Sorry, Adrian. And if Adrian could possibly contact me via Twitter or something, I'd love to see the evidence for that, because that doesn't surprise me at all. But that's really very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good way to kind of to end really, is to get some learning that we're all learning. And this is the thing me and Woody said when we started this channel, this is a journey for everybody. You never stop learning as a military historian.
And I know I said I was not going to say anything, but I was going to say that it's with something like the Somme, like with what I do with World War II TV, is that when you're beginning your learning, you have to often remove the false information you have in your head from media, from social, from just this you've got over the years. And if I'm starting fresh with a battle I know nothing about, I'm not starting at a minus point. I'm starting at 0. But I think with the Somme, so much of what I thought I knew clearly is not the case. So I'm starting at a minus position. At the end of today's show, I'm now at kind of a 0. But now I feel I can start moving forward and actually taking on some actually proper information, having had a few of the myths dislodged somewhat.
Well, it's kind of you to say so. Can I do a shameless plug?
Please do.
Sorry.
Right, I didn't mention this in earlier conversations with Lucy, because I wasn't quite sure where it was to go. I'm launching a podcast with my friend and colleague Dr. Spencer Jones called Military History Plus, and we're launching the first program I think next week or the week afterwards. So
amazing!
Please look out for us.
Definitely, that sounds awesome.
Fantastic. More the merrier. Podcasts, YouTube channels, that we love them when these new things start up. There's a massive audience out there who want to learn. So fantastic news. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Gary, any final thoughts on the Somme? What's the final takeaway for you? What would you like viewers to kind of go away from tonight just thinking about the battle?
Right. There's 2 things, I think. First of all, I hope no one listening to me tonight thinks in any way I've downplayed the sheer level of tragedy and horror, because every time I read about the Somme, when I go to the Somme, I'm struck by what a ghastly experience it was for everybody. And the sort of catchphrase I've come up with is the Somme, the First World War for that matter, was tragic, but it wasn't futile. So that's the first bit. The second bit is that I don't think that the sheer horror and tragedy of the Somme should, however, blind us to its broader context. I remember once I was criticised for using the phrase Haig tried to get his army to run before it could walk, because someone said, "Oh, that's dreadful, you know, you're referring to the walking slowly over the Somme, this is very bad taste." Well, I didn't have that in mind at all, but actually it's not enough. It certainly it does the memory of the blokes of 1916 no favours at all, just to pigeonhole them as being victims in this senseless, futile battle. It wasn't senseless, it wasn't futile, it was horrendous, it had meaning, and really the best legacy, I think, is that people today, historians of today, make an attempt to understand its true significance.
I think that's a perfect note to end things on, Gary. Thank you once again for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to everybody for watching, for your comments, questions. You know, we're so excited with this channel, and I've now just got, my mind is buzzing with all these other shows that I want to do now. So thank you very much. And we've got some fantastic shows lined up, and we will be back. When's our next one, Woody? Can't remember now.
The 5th. Try the 5th. Yeah. Prit Retard's coming on to talk about the formation of the Baltic states at the end of the First World War. So just to let you know what the theme is for these introductory shows, it is to kind of bring the World War II people to World War I. So the shows will be connecting those two wars, because that is one of the things, as we explained earlier, Lucy and I, that we want to do. So Mike Nyberg is going to be taking us through the Treaty of Versailles, so how it ends one war and kicks off the second, I suppose, is a summary of that. John McManus is coming on to talk about how the Americans went into the First World War, how they came out of it, how it morphed their expectations, their worldview, their doctrine, and what have you. So that's the theme for these first few shows. And then when Lucy goes flying solo a bit later on, it'll be more the focused First World War, but still making these comparisons with World War II and making connections with World War II TV. So that's just keep plugging away, keep subscribing, sharing what we're doing. I will add the links to Gary's new podcast when I get them in the description below. And that's back. So Lucy, just close out the show for us, please.
Yeah, just thanks everyone. Thanks again, Gary. And see you all soon.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.